Hey everybody. So just to reiterate the themes that we've been touching on the last few weeks. First, we've talked about how organisms respond to their environment, looking at the different domains, the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukaryotes. We've also talked about how these different types of organisms maintain homeostasis, specifically looking at thermoregulation and osmoregulation. And now we're going to move into this third part here, talking about how different taxa acquire and process nutrients. So a couple of the learning outcomes for this next unit is number one, students should be able to use examples of something called macromolecules and different types of metabolic reactions like cellular respiration to explain why organisms require nutrients and which nutrients they require. You should be able to classify organisms based on their means of generating ATP and obtaining carbon. So basically photo versus chemo versus auto versus heterotrophy, which is something that we've covered before, and provide examples of each type of trophy. So for example, plants are photoautotrophs. You should be able to compare and contrast the adaptations that unicellular organisms, fungi, plants, and animals use to acquire and transport nutrients. You should be able to use examples to explain why surface area to volume ratios are particularly critical for structures that function in nutrient uptake and transport. So I'll show you some examples of that. You should be able to identify and explain examples of trade-offs and also symbiosis in nutrient uptake and transport. You should be able to explain how carbon cycles and how energy flows through systems. So for example, how a plant transforms and converts energy in carbon atoms, and also where plants get the majority of their dry mass from. For example, is this from the nutrients? Is this from the soil? Is this from air? Where do plants get their dry mass from? You should be able to explain something called Liebig's law of the minimum and how this relates to organismal growth, which nutrients typically limit plant growth, and how limiting nutrients can be determined experimentally, and practical applications of this idea of Liebig's law of the minimum. And there's several readings that are associated with these learning outcomes. So we'll talk about plant and nutrient uptake in these sections, 27.4 through 27.5. You should review plant growth and nutrition in section 32.1. Animal gas exchange, so sections 37.1 to 37.2. And also animal metabolism and nutrition, so sections 38.1 through 38.4. And just to reiterate, all of these learning outcomes that I've listed right here will also be posted on the Exam 3 study guide that's posted on Canvas under the Exam 3 module. Okay, so let's start off talking about what a nutrient is. So a nutrient is defined as a substance that provides nourishment essential for the growth and maintenance of life. So when we talk about nutrients and we get into sort of the specifics that all nutrients need or all organisms need to survive, there's three major types of what are called macromolecules that compose all living organisms. And these are sort of essential parts of all the nutrients that organisms need. So organisms, or the macromolecules that comprise all living organisms, include proteins. So here we're looking at a string of amino acids that make up a protein macromolecule. Polysaccharides are other example, or a second example of a macromolecule. So polysaccharides are things like starch, glycogen, cellulose. So these are saccharides, means sugar, poly means many, so it's many sugars that are linked together here in these chains. This is an example of a polysaccharide. And these are once again our important macromolecule that compose all living organisms. And then the third major macromolecule that we'll talk about are nucleic acids. So DNA and RNA are examples of nucleic acids. And nucleic acids are, of course, made up of nucleotides, individual nucleotides. And so these are all examples of macromolecules. And macromolecules are defined as being polymers. So poly means many, and so they're composed of smaller building blocks. And those building blocks that make up polymers are called monomers. Okay, so macromolecules are a type of polymer, and those polymers are made up of monomers. And so we can identify the monomers that make up each of these different types of essential macromolecules. Proteins are composed of individual amino acids. Polysaccharides are composed of sugars. Nucleic acids are composed of nucleotides. And most of this stuff should be a review for you guys. The one thing that I'd like to mention before we move on to the next slide is that there's little asterisks next to the three major types of macromolecules that compose all living organisms. Technically, lipids are also a very important group of molecules that compose or are part of all living organisms. And they're composed of complex carbon chains and they're things that all organisms require. But technically, these are not necessarily a macromolecule because they're not technically a polymer. Okay, real quick, answer this question. What are the 3 types of macromolecules that all living organisms need to have? All right, you should have said proteins, polysaccharides, and nucleic acids. And the next question, what are the main elements? So remember chemical elements, okay? So like the periodic chart elements. What are the elements that make up these macromolecules? And remember, these macromolecules are composed of these monomers, and you can see from the chemical structure of these monomers, you can begin to guess at what are the main elements that make up these individual macromolecules. So go ahead and write the answer to that. All right, so you should have seen that these macromolecules are composed of these individual monomers, and these monomers in turn are composed of carbons, oxygens that you can see here, hydrogens that you can see everywhere. You can see some phosphoruses as well, some nitrogens as well that make up these individual monomers. And so this is a key point, this is an important point here, is this fundamental idea of the conservation of mass. So the conservation of mass basically says that you can't get mass from nothing. You can't get something from nothing. Organisms cannot create matter from nothing. They cannot create elements from nothing. They have to acquire those atoms and elements that make up these essential macromolecules from the environment, okay? So they can't just make up these carbon atoms from nowhere. They have to get those carbon atoms from somewhere in the environment. Same thing with the oxygens and hydrogens, nitrogens, and phosphoruses. And so this is the reason why organisms need nutrients, is because we've got to get those individual atoms that make up these important essential macromolecules from the environment. And those are the sort of nutrients that we need to acquire. Okay, so we've talked about the 3 types of macromolecules that are required. We've talked about the main elements that make up these sort of essential macromolecules. Now let's talk about the other nutrients organisms need to survive. And those are essential vitamins and minerals. Okay, so essential vitamins and minerals are elements or compounds other than those listed above that organisms can't synthesize on their own. In other words, they have to get them from their environment. And these are sometimes called micronutrients or trace elements, okay? And these are typically involved in very important biological reactions, and many of these essential vitamins and minerals are group or taxa specific. So some vitamins and minerals that are essential for animals are different than those essential vitamins and minerals for plants, and even within different types of animals, some have different essential vitamins and minerals that they need than, like, you know, certain insects require different vitamins and minerals than mice, than rabbits, than humans, so on and so forth. So these are very sort of taxa specific, what the essential vitamins and minerals are that are required. And as I said before, they're involved in very important biological reactions, and you can see really bad effects if you don't have them. So just to give you an example of some of these important macronutrients, so for example, humans require iron to bind oxygen and hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is an important molecule in red blood cells. At the center of each little heme group that makes up a hemoglobin molecule, there's an iron atom. And if you don't have those iron atoms, you can't make heme, you can't make hemoglobin, you don't have red blood cells to transport oxygen, okay? So this is a great example of an essential sort of process that this essential nutrient or micronutrient is involved in. Same thing with vitamin C or ascorbic acid. You got to have this essential mineral or this essential vitamin in order to prevent this disease called scurvy that you'll get if you don't have vitamin C. Same thing with things like ions like potassium and sodium. So potassium and sodium are key ions in creating action potentials that travel across neurons to send basically signals through your body, through the central nervous system. You need to pass basically sodium and potassium ions to have this action potential that sends a signal down a neuron. In addition, sodium, potassium are really important in these sodium-potassium pumps. So these are ion pumps that are in a cell membrane. These pumps are really essential for a ton of cellular functions and moving things back and forth across cell membranes. And if you don't have sodium and potassium, you're not going to be able to do that. Organisms are not going to be able to survive. So once again, super important for things like osmoregulation, nerve signaling, and these are just a few examples of the types of things that essential vitamins and minerals can do for us. And it's important to know that organisms need different amounts of each nutrient. So for example, if you were to look up the sort of ratios of the major nutrients that make up a human being, they're about 65% oxygen, 18% carbon, 10% hydrogen, 3% nitrogen, and then the rest is made up of a bunch of different other types of nutrients. So that's not to say that we're just oxygen, it's that oxygen is a part of all of these essential sort of macromolecules, chemicals, proteins, and enzymes that make us up. And carbon is a big part of them, hydrogen is a big part of them, so on and so forth. Okay, so we're not just made out of oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. It's those elements as part of these important sort of biological molecules that make us up, and as well as non-biological molecules that make us up, like water. So water is hydrogen and oxygen, and that's a big part of our biomass too. And when you break down the actual sort of elements that make us up, and you look at the sort of percentage of our body weight that those represent, you can see the different percentages of these different sort of molecules that make us up, including these trace elements down here. So this is, once again, specific just to humans. This will vary according to the different species that you're looking at. But you can break these down into different groups called macronutrients. So for example, oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus are considered to be macronutrients for humans, or those that organisms need in relatively large amounts. So the macronutrients for humans that are in relatively large amounts typically include this list, so oxygen down through phosphorus, that make up 1% or greater of our total sort of percentage of body mass. And these other elements down here are often considered to be micronutrients. And micronutrients are just those that organisms need in relatively small amounts. And some textbooks, depending what you read, might list everything from magnesium up through oxygen as micronutrients, or might list everything or as macronutrients. And some might list everything as calcium all the way down to these trace elements as micronutrients. And so it'll vary sort of how exactly textbooks define what are the macro versus micronutrients. I don't care about you knowing exactly what the list of macro versus micronutrients are. What I do care about you knowing is understanding the difference between a macro versus micronutrient in terms of needing relatively more of the macronutrients versus relatively fewer of the micronutrients. And also having a general idea of what are the major sort of nutrients that make up the human body. Okay. Which of the following is correct? If you said D, that is the correct answer. So carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen are important macronutrients. They are not macromolecules. So these are individual elements that make up macromolecules. Macromolecules are things like proteins, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates. And these are not important macronutrients. So the macronutrients are the things like carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen that play a big role or make up a large percentage of these individual important macromolecules. Macronutrients are composed of micronutrients. That's false. These are just two completely separate things. So macromolecules are composed of monomers, but macronutrients are not composed of micronutrients. These are just two completely separate things. And only heterotrophic organisms like animals need micronutrients, because autotrophic organisms like plants can synthesize their own carbon atoms. So this is false. Remember that law of conservation of mass, conservation of matter. No organisms can synthesize their own atoms. So even plants, even though they're autotrophic, still have to get carbon atoms from the environment somewhere to build their sort of more complex carbon molecules. And so this was the correct choice. Macromolecule polymers like proteins are composed of monomers like amino acids. Okay, so just as a quick recap, we talked about the nutrients that all organisms need. We broke them up into these different groups of macromolecules that are types of polymers that are composed of monomers. We talked about macronutrients versus micronutrients. And micronutrients, another word for them can be essential vitamins and minerals. And lastly, we talked about this idea of conservation of matter. This is an important concept. And it just means that organisms can't generate the elements that make up macromolecules and monomers and polymers from nowhere. They have to get them from the environment. That's why we need to consume nutrients. That's why organisms need nutrients from the environment, because they can't make their own individual elements. So up next in the next lecture, we'll talk about the generalities of nutrient acquisition and different types of trophy, and this should be a bit of a review.